Chris Lee and Blake Lovell of Southeastern 14 here. We are continuing our previews of SEC basketball teams for the upcoming season. Shout out to our title sponsor, Stakes. We'll be having lots of basketball-related stuff in the app this year. But right now, we're talking about the Vanderbilt Commodores. And, man, I can't believe it. This is going to be year 4 under Coach Jerry Stackhouse.
Yeah, it is something, isn't it? It's just kind of, I don't know, like it's all a blur. We say this all the time.
Yes.
I think especially, it's just all a blur sometimes, and it is kind of wild to think this will be his 4th season there. Clearly, have not had the results that they've wanted to this point. I think just in terms of the win total, I don't think we're saying anything that's people would be that unsurprised by. But the thing is, Chris, is when you look at the trajectory of things. Last season was a big step forward, I think, in terms of the ability to maybe gain a little momentum as a program. And to win 19 games. And that's why I said, even though maybe you haven't had the success you wanted, you do feel like you turned a corner last year. The issue becomes now is that, one of the big players that helped you, I think, turn that corner in Scottie Pippen is not there anymore. And it's sort of like it's a makeover in terms of, okay, what does the program now look like without him? Because, he has been such a big part of that for the past several seasons. And even if the wins weren't there, you felt like at least they were right there in terms of competitiveness and all that, and feeling like they were finally going to kind of get over that hump from the previous regime and kind of realistically just bottoming out as a program. And that was an important step last year. And even though 19 and 17, to some teams would be very disappointing, I think for Vanderbilt, it's not where you want to be, but it's a big step in the right direction. And again, like I said, now it's just a matter of, can you do that without the guy that really just, propelled a lot of things forward and gave them a chance in a lot of these games that they've won in the Jerry Stackhouse era. Now to do it without Scottie Pippen, I think that's the big question.
This program is in a weird place. And we're going to talk about the roster in a minute, but let's just backtrack a bit. 4 seasons ago, Vanderbilt went 0-18, lost 20 games or something like that to end the season. It's the first, I think, 0 in the SEC in I don't know how many years. Bryce Drew gets fired. Malcolm Turner, who was there for a day, their athletic director at the time, hired Stackhouse. And then they ran Turner off a few months later in just a bizarre set of circumstances. And now Stackhouse goes into year 4. He has improved the program. This will be the first team solely of his own guys. Yeah. He sort of recruited Pippen. He was signed under Bryce Drew. Stackhouse kept him on. So he kind of gets credit for that. But this is the first one that is all his players. By the way, quick aside. Here's a good winning bar bet for people. And I'm going to see if you can get the answer. How many future NBA players, and by future NBA players, I mean players who played at least one game in the NBA, were on that roster that went winless in the SEC?
Let's see. Saban Lee, Aaron Nesmith, was he there? Yeah,
he was there.
Darius Garland, 3.
Yes.
I mean, the only I don't know. Has he played in the NBA yet?
No, that would be 5. Matt Ryan actually played.
I forgot about Matt Ryan
in the NBA. Yeah. Well, that was such a weird season. And of course, Garland didn't play in any of the SEC games, as I've got something in my eye here. But just a weird turn of events it has been. And this is a program that has just seemed cursed. Mm-hmm. I cannot remember the last time Vanderbilt went through a season without a major part of its roster, like best 1, 2, 3 players. I think Vanderbilt's had its best player almost miss a couple of games for, I don't know, 6, 7, maybe 8 years running. It is just crazy. 10 years ago, this was like, if you talked SEC it was probably Kentucky, Florida, Tennessee. But then after that, Vanderbilt was as good as anybody on a running basis, and sometimes better than some of those teams. And this is the team now that's not won an NCAA tournament game since 2011 has been, went once under Bryce Drew, 5 years ago. I mean, it's just, this is a weird place for a program that used to be very consistent.
Yeah, and that was the thing is like, we talked about kind of the Kevin Stallings era and those kind of things, and it's like we feel like we should get to that next level, right? But the level you were at was not was not bad.
No.
It was one where you were pretty consistent for the most part in terms of the expectation. And again, it's just you talked about just the almost like a curse at times where it just feels like things just go wrong, and you've seen kind of what can happen when they do go wrong, especially in the SEC. And I think it's a combination of things to me. Is it's not just that Vanderbilt has had these issues; it's the fact that the league has gotten better too, like at around the same time. Like Vanderbilt went in the wrong direction at the worst possible time because that's really when the league started to make its ascent. Like the big jump came around that time, right? When you think about it, that's really just sort of again a bad combination, and I think that's where, like we've said, Vanderbilt gets better last year and maybe turns a corner. The problem continues to be the same. It's that it's not necessarily are you getting better? It's just what you're chasing now. And you're chasing the fact that there are usually at least 8 teams probably the past several seasons where we've gone into the season thinking, all right, those 8 teams got a really good chance to make the NCAA tournament. And if you're not a part of that group, right, it just becomes a bit of a challenge, and you have to figure out a way to somehow make your way into that conversation. But right now, it's just been much harder because we've seen the teams that have gotten to Final Four, Sweet 16s, preseason top 15 teams. You could have 4 or 5 of those this year. So that's kind of the expectation. And it's just hard to get back there once you go in the opposite way. So,
well, Blake, Scotty Pippen Jr. was the engine that made this team go. He was preseason SEC Player of the Year heading into last year. We knew that probably wasn't going to happen because the Commodores were not expected to compete at the top of the league. They did not. In fact, they are perpetually in that Wednesday night game of the SEC tournament, it seems like now. I think the sense is the program is headed in a better direction. Stackhouse had his best recruiting class. But I look at this roster and say it is very hard to replace a go-to guy in basketball that could score at the level Scottie Pippen Jr. could. I mean, he could give you 30 points, go 15 to 15 from the line. It seemed like that kid could get fouled at will. And I look at this roster, and maybe it's deeper. Maybe it's a little bit more talented top to bottom. But I look at it and I say, I don't see another Pippen on the roster. Jordan Wright is their leading returning scorer. And actually, Jordan Wright, if you look it up, had some really good games at the end of last season. I think had 25 against Kentucky, had another game, something like that in Vanderbilt's first round NIT win against Belmont. The kid barely missed any shots between those 2 games. But it is different when you don't have a Pippen who's the focus of attention. I don't know that Wright is going to be a go-to scorer that you can get 20 when you need him to. I just don't know that he's that kind of player. He's a solid player, but the focus is probably going to shift to him, or it could be Liam Robbins, who led the Big Ten in blocks 2 years ago at Minnesota. Robbins made a difference when he was on the floor a year ago, but it was the on the floor part that was an issue. He had a foot injury that kept him out much of the year. I don't know that he played 30 minutes in a game a season ago. Robbins is the kind of kid that can sort of make a big impact on both ends of the floor, but I question his ability to stay healthy over a full season given what we've seen in the past. Now, I think from what I have heard, Vanderbilt's at full health in the offseason as we do this in mid-October, which is a rarity for that program. But I think it's going to have to be probably either Wright or Robbins, who is their carrying guy. And I have some doubts about the ability of either one to lead them at the level in that role that Pippen did.
Well, that's the thing is like it's a nice thing to have both of these guys and have the option of probably playing off of each other in terms of the point. They're going to have to, be two of the top scorers. I don't think there's any doubt about that if they're going to win some games. But the difference is what you kind of said was it's fine to have two guys that can at any time, score 20 points, right? Like these two guys can, Wright and Robbins can both at any time go off for 20 points. But it's another thing to have just a top tier superstar that the expectation is that every game they're going to score 20 something points. And I think there can be a difference there. And I don't know, again, if you're going to get that necessarily with these two guys, but I do think there's at least some optimism that combine the two together with Wright and Robbins, and they'll be able to certainly help pick up some of that slack scoring wise. Again, they don't have a choice. I mean, if Vanderbilt's going to win games, they have to. But so I think there's a lot to build on there. You talked about Wright, especially like you could see towards the end of the season, some of those performances, like the confidence is there. There's no doubt about it. And I just think that it's just going to be so different, right? I think that's probably the biggest thing is watching their offense, like how much different it is in terms of how things kind of flow, because Pippen was someone that had the ball in his hands so much. And I think now that you take that away, there's going to be some big differences because I mean, it's you're going to look at okay, how does that impact like how Robbins is built into the offense? What does that look like from a standpoint of Wright? But it's kind of fun to think about too is how they're going to tweak how they play offense and that we'll talk about more of the guard group in a second, with the newcomers. But I think that's probably the biggest thing for me is as I look at it is it's not just a matter of, yes, I think we know that those are the two guys that have to lead the way, but it's what does that even look like from an offensive standpoint, just in terms of how they're built versus we know how teams game planned against them in the past several seasons. It was just you knew Scottie Pippen was going to have the ball in his hands on every single possession. And now it's how do we get our offense built to where everything flows through these guys because – right, Chris, they're not going to be the primary ball handlers in this scenario. So how is everything kind of built to where we make sure that these are the guys that are touching the ball in every possession, whereas before it was your point guard was kind of your go-to guy. So I'm very curious to see how that plays out too.
Well, you bring up some good things that are some good talking points here. Okay, I think Stackhouse wants his offense to be run by a pass first point guard, which Pippen was more of a scoring point guard. And I mean, that's that's great to want. I think they're going to end up looking back and nothing against Ezra Manjon, who's going to be their point guard. We'll talk about him in a minute. But he's not quite that kind of guy. Pippen could just, it's just hard for me to not understand. I wonder how it's going to translate, right? Like you take Pippen off the roster. It's not just the numbers, it's like Stackhouse likes to run. I don't know if you call it a dribble drive offense or not. You're better at knowing what to call those things than I am, but it was a lot of times based on point guard penetration and kickouts. And his teams at times have gotten a lot of really great looks from three, although they don't, maybe some of that is you don't fear the shooters as much. They've had some good shooters, but it's not Vanderbilt basketball that you're accustomed to, where for 30 or 35 years they could put four guys on the floor that seemed like they'd shoot 40% from three. This is not that kind of team he's gotten. So I wonder about taking Pippen out of that. I think this team is going to be very heavy on the defensive end. You look at their Ken Pom numbers defensively, Blake. They have really improved tremendously from 2 years ago. I want to say they were low 200s to cut that down significantly a year ago and were much better. I think last year they were top 50. I think that's going to be what this team is. It is going to be more of a grind you, maybe press you type team. And it's going to have a different look with Ezra Manjon running the point. Now, I'm looking at his career free throw percentages. He was 76, 87, and 72 working backwards, 72 being last year's number at Cal Irvine. And you know his coach at Irvine, I think
Davis.
Jim Les.
UC Davis.
Excuse me, UC Davis. Wrong Cal school.
A lot of UCs out there. So
Russell Turner is at UC Irvine.
That's right.
And they've been a good program. So no disrespect to the Cal schools, but anyway, you happen to know his coach, and you know he had a very high opinion of his old point guard.
Yeah, I mean, Jim Les is the coach at UC Davis. Just for reference, I did the Big West for 3 seasons, I think, for Blue Ribbon. And so I got to know those guys pretty well out there. And look, I mean, anytime I went to build my all Big West team heading into the season, like, he's pretty much right there. Like, I'm going to put him on that list. Manjon, like, he was just part of that group that I was like, all right, he's probably going to be on there somewhere. And he's a really, really talented player. Like, he really is. And like I said, Jim Les was very high on him in terms of his ability to lead UC Davis, his offense. And he was, talking about just all kind of the flexibility they had with him being able to have the ball in his hands and knowing that you felt pretty confident about a guy like that and what he could do scoring wise. So I think that's something where, you bring him in now. And again, you're talking about a player too that's pretty experienced. Like, I'm pretty sure, honestly, Chris, when I go back, like, he played a lot as a freshman there. Like, he has played a lot of minutes. And I think that's very important too to kind of think about, is this was not just a guy who stepped in and all of a sudden kind of just had one season and that was that. Like, he came right in and he was playing, and he's pretty much done that every single season. So yes, it's different coming from, the Big West to the SEC, but he is someone that's played a lot, and he's played a lot of minutes. You go back to last year, right? I mean, he's playing, pretty much every Big West game. He's playing 32 plus minutes somewhere in there. And I think that's kind of just, again, I like the experience factor of having him doing that. So it is someone who's had the ball in his hands a lot for a lot of minutes in Division I college basketball. So I do like that kind of aspect. And I think, when you look at the way his game is built, he does feel like he's someone that will fit right into what Jerry Stackhouse wants to do, and I think that's going to be something too that's kind of very important, like you said, and what's going to be a new look offense for them. That's important to know that I think he's got the speed, he's got the scoring ability, he's got the passing ability. And it's just a matter of, again, doing all that in the SEC. Is the numbers going to be the same as they were in the Big West? Probably not. But I think it's handling that, the physicality, all the other stuff that we know that comes along with playing in the SEC. And I think that's going to probably be the biggest question there when you look at him and how he's kind of built into this offense.
Blake, I meant earlier to circle back to Jordan Wright. And I think there's a case. Well, I think there's definitely a case. He's one of the more underappreciated players in the SEC. I remember last year when we were having fun with our East-West teams, Wright was a guy that was kind of on that list of next guys. And I watch him, and he's not the most gifted guy. He didn't need to be the go-to guy because they had Pippen. Then I watched him on the stretch in those 2 aforementioned games where, and again, we'll see if he can do it with Pippen gone, but he kind of won them a couple of games, or won them a game in NIT, and really had them that close to pulling an upset of Kentucky in the SEC tournament. He shoots 43% from the field, 35% from three, averaged 12.3 points, 6.4 rebounds. He led Vandy in rebounds a year ago. Is kind of a, forward/guard. He's a bigger bodied kid. I think the biggest knock on him is turnovers. He had 85 a year ago to 64 assists. You never want to see a perimeter guy with 20 more turnovers than assists. But he had 50 steals. He's not particularly quick, but he's a big-bodied guy who kind of knows how to use angles and plays hard. I'm interested to see what it looks for Jordan Wright. Can he take those numbers and bump them up a step without Pippen being around? Because if he can, you're talking about a kid who's maybe at the end of the year sneaks onto the third-team All-SEC team.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what we just talked about. I think it's a lot of that's going to be dependent on the guard play around him, and I think seeing how consistent that is, because I think that's the bigger part of this equation too. Is I think he's capable of doing all that. Like we saw, I mentioned last year. I think there's a lot of confidence there in terms of just the evolution of his game, and you could see a lot of good things in what he talked about, like this the rebounding, and it's not just the scoring, it's the other stuff too. And um I think what happens around him is going to be just as important, because it's different just not having a guy that Jordan Wright's not going to be the point guard. And so I think it's how that continues to sort of develop around him will be just as important, because this is again one of those where, and that's what, like, I hate to keep bringing it up, but it's so different, because you had a guy who had the ball in his hands as much as Scottie Pippen did, and it's almost like you're kind of just playing off of him, and he's the one that's kind of just driving everything. But it's going to be different this year in that you know your point guard's still going to be the guy that's driving everything, but it's just such a different dynamic. So I think that's probably one of the more interesting aspects of looking at what Jordan Wright can do this season, because skill wise, it's there. It's just he has to be put. I think they have to put him in that position to succeed in what's going to be kind of a different dynamic in terms of how they play on that side of the floor.
The other guy that I think is maybe the biggest wild card on the team is Miles Studi, who was I think he was about a 40% 3-point. No, he's 43.2%, and that's on 183 attempts. Miles Studi made a lot of shots from long distance. Now, Miles Studi also can be a defensive liability. Had 13 assists to 25 turnovers. He's kind of a one-dimensional guy. He, probably picks up too many technical fouls. I mean, like right now he is giving them shooting, and it's hard to find much else. But the shooting has been really good. And you look at his end of the year numbers, he was canning a lot of threes down the stretch for them last season.
I mean, you gotta have him on this team. Yeah, I think you look around and realize that this is like you said, that there may be some things in other areas that he's not as good at. In terms of comparing him to some of his peers, but he's the best 3-point shooter, and you've got to have that element. I mean, we've talked about that, right? Not with other teams. Like, you have to have some sort of 3-point presence, and I think his ability to knock down those shots is going to make him a very valuable resource on this team in a lot of different ways. I mean, Jordan Wright shot about 35% from three, I think.
Pippen shot 33.
Pippen, yeah. But I mean, look, you're getting Wright back. Trey Thomas made some threes. So I think this is actually a pretty interesting group from the 3-point shooting dynamic, because you do have, what's it going to be? Your top 4 3-point shooters back in Studi, Wright, and Thomas. So, and like we said, you're bringing in some guys too, I think, that can make some shots from the perimeter. So that is just, if that's your role, that's your role. And I think on this team, Studi is that he understands the role. Like, I think he'll have to get better in some of those areas you talked about. But I mean, just like we said, it's really not all that different, I think, from Wright and Robbins, in that everyone has to elevate their scoring. And I just think that, he's another candidate here that we're talking about that's going to have to elevate his scoring to where he's going to have to, have some of those games where he's making, scoring double digits, right? Like, I mean, that's going to have to happen. And maybe that just comes off of 4 threes. Maybe he scores 12 points and it's 4 threes. That's great. But like, you need more of that, I think, and you're going to need more of that on this team. So yeah, I think there's a lot of intrigue there with him, because he's someone that I think you can see what's there. It's just, you play to the strengths, and his strength is find a way in this offense to get him open threes, and you feel pretty good that he's going to knock those shots down. So that's an important element, I think, on this 22-23 version of the Commodores.
Yeah, last year he hit 79 threes. He hit 22s.
Yeah.
So no mystery about what he is.
No.
Now, I think Trey Thomas was a very streaky player for them. I don't know what his role is going to be. There are times I think he is close to extinct on that team, and then he'll come in and hit 5 threes. I think he's grown an inch or two, they've said, in the offseason. You've got Tyron Lawrence, who has not been able to stay healthy. He was, I think, a top 150 kid, borderline in high school. He started to take a bigger role. I think he played a lot of minutes in their trip to Europe. We know what Thomas is. Thomas is another 3-point shooter off the bench. Hit 60 field goals last year, 45 from three, 84% foul shooter, but defensive liability. And then whatever Lawrence is, and I'm not entirely sure, but I know he's kind of a Stackhouse favorite.
Yeah, I'm curious with those guys and kind of what their role looks like, because again, if you look just from a minute standpoint, I mean, the guys who have played minutes, right? And I think that's important too, is to have guys coming back who did play, kind of the minutes they played. But I think it's the same conversation. Like, you're talking about guys that we know the role of pretty much everyone on this team is going to expand, right? Like, that's the hope, is that everyone can kind of expand their roles, because there is some stuff you have to make up for. And I think with those two guys, but sometimes, Chris, too, it can be just as valuable to have two guys you can rely on off the bench that don't have to play 25 plus minutes a game. It's just, can you put them in the position to where they've got an opportunity, to help you out in a variety of ways, and maybe it's not playing a ton of minutes, but just, I think maybe that's kind of how you look at these guys, and some of the other guys we'll talk about that they brought in. It's just, I think the most important part, and I always say sometimes I think depth can be overrated, but I think on this team, I just think having a variety of options is going to be a good thing, because there are going to be some of those guys that maybe don't hit what you think they're going to hit, but there may be some other guys that surprise you, and I don't have any doubt about that. There's probably going to be some guys on this roster that we come in thinking, I don't really know what their role is going to be, but maybe they just wind up being guys that are rock solid and play 20 minutes a game. But I think having that variety of options is going to be a good thing for Jerry Stackhouse and his staff, because with the newcomer specifically, the expectation is some of those guys are going to have to play a lot of minutes. And I think if you can have kind of that rock solid group around them of returners that may have their minutes go up, may have their minutes go down, having that depth in the SEC, knowing that injury is going to happen and all that other stuff, that's a good thing to have. So that they just need to find some of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit a very important point there, Blake. I mean, the injuries have just really hurt them. There's been times where they barely had 7 playable guys at different points. I think this roster is different. He brought in his best recruiting class. We'll get to that in a minute. But they've got an interesting situation in the paint too. Okay, we've talked about Robbins. He's a big guy. He's 7 foot and he's thick. I think having him for a full season can be very interesting to see what he can be. They've got behind him Quentin Malloy-Brown, who, again, I don't think the stats do him justice. He doesn't really block a lot. He blocked 38 shots. That's more than I would have thought. 5.6 rebounds a game in 24.3 minutes. Doesn't score much, 5.3 points. But he doesn't waste a lot of possessions. Man, he only missed 40 shots a year ago. Shot 65% from the field. Had 42 assists and 34 turnovers. It is not often you see a big man that has more assists than turnovers, but that's the case with Quentin Malloy-Brown. He's just very solid. He's a very smart kid. I think he is an electrical engineering major who transferred from Rice. And then they signed Lee Dort, who, according to some of these services, was their highest rated recruit. Dort is kind of a smaller version of Robbins in that he's thick. But I've seen him. I got to see one of their open practices recently. He's not overweight. He's a big kid. They got 3 big dudes in the post, Blake. And I talked to Stackhouse about it. He's not inclined, I think, to use Malloy-Brown and Robbins at the same time, which I don't know. I think at some point, I think those 2 guys are both in their best 5 players. So I don't know how they manage that. Maybe injuries manage it for them. But that's a very interesting trio in the post. And they got some other guys we'll talk about momentarily that can maybe fit at the 4 too. But that's in a time where bigs are not the thing. Vandy's got some depth there that it has not had in a while.
And now we've come to the strength of the team because we have not necessarily been able to say that. You know, it's been a while, right? Because we've always kind of talked about the guard play, whether that was Scottie Pippen, whether that was Saban Lee, whether that was other guys. Like, not that they haven't had good big guys, but I think the amount of depth they have in the front court, like potential depth here, like I think this is very impressive. Like this is an impressive group on paper. Um, because again, you take Robbins, like we said, if he's healthy, we know what he can be. Malore Brown is just like, again, we talk about just give me a rock solid big guy that can, you know, not necessarily hurt you. And I don't think he does. Like he's just someone that can come in and give you quality minutes. And I don't know what his minutes look like in the rotation this year, but I think he's an option, right? And then Dort, I mean, this guy is just, I think he's built like someone who's going to come in and just be able to. We talk about adjusting to the SEC, right? And we always kind of say guards and big man, like who sometimes that adjustment can be a little bit harder for the big man than it is the guard play. But I mean, honestly, Chris, like the way this guy is built and the athleticism that he has, I think he's going to be fine. And that's where this is a very intriguing part of this roster because when you look at all three of these, 6'9" for Dort, what's Malora Brown, 6'10", Robbins is 7 foot. Man, I mean, you've got some options
How many
there.
how many Power 5 teams have three bigs like that?
Well, and think about what we've talked about like in recent seasons with Auburn, right? I mean, and we're not comparing these guys to Jabari Smith and Walker Kessler, but just the luxury you have of maybe having two guys like that on the floor at the same time. And I don't know what Jerry Stackhouse decides to do with this in terms of, who's playing what. And obviously you're not going to see all three of these guys playing together, but I think though, still, like you look at Auburn last year, look at Auburn this year. We talked about the group they have, Traore, Broom. Yeah, like when you've got three big guys like this, I mean, that's a very, there's a lot you can do. And especially, like I said, on the defensive end of the floor, that can be just as important in terms of what they're going to do there. So, I mean, this is a team with good size. Like and we're not even not even necessarily talking about the big guys, right? Like you go across the board, this is a team with good size. And I think, the athleticism is there. And as long as the physicality is there, I think that could be one of the more underrated things maybe as we get into the season of this team is that their size may be able to kind of propel them forward too, just on making them good defensively, rim protection, rebounding, scoring in the paint. Like those are all elements that are going to be important. And I think when you just look at the makeup of just this trio itself, and again, having some size, Tootie's about 6'7", 6'8". I think there's a lot of possibilities just given the size of this team. So,
well, and then we get to the rest of their freshman class, which they got Colin Smith, who was a top 150 by a lot of people. Malik Dia, who I think same
6'8",
boat.
by the way. Another big guy, 6'8".
Yeah, they've got some size. Stackhouse called, I think Malik Dia the most talented player on their team. I don't know where that's going to head with him the first year. Colin Smith got a lot of playing time in Europe, and he seems like a little bit of a stat sheet stuffer. Again, I got to go watch him practice a little bit. I'm not going to say he was running point guard, but I mean there were several times he was bringing the ball up the floor and initiating the offense. And they got Noah Shelby, who was Dort's teammate, was a really high scoring point guard, had an injury there. This is the best class he's brought in, hands down. I mean, the knock against Stackhouse has been recruiting, and I think it's fair. I don't think his classes have been very good in terms of what he has brought to campus. But right when Bryce Drew's recruits ran out on him, he picked up his effort a bit. They got Paul Lewis from Maryland late. He decommitted after the coaching change there. Lewis is probably going to be, 11th, 12th man on the roster kind of guy this year, I would think, but we'll see. But that's a place where some freshmen have got a chance to pop in and contribute. I'm not sure how it all fits together. I think Smith will be probably one of their first two guys off the bench, and then we'll see if the others can really secure a role in an 8 or 9 man rotation.
Well, Shelby's going to help with the shooting. I don't think there's any doubt about that. You need, I think he's going to give them an element of that, and that will be important. So again, you talk about finding your way into the rotation. I think just the ability for him to shoot the ball from outside is going to be important along with Studi. Like we said, we know Thomas can hit some shots. So I like that dynamic there of having that, as a possibility, even though you are talking about a freshman here, but I think it is someone that, you know, I think that there's some fun too in putting Shelby and Dort out there together, knowing that there's already chemistry built in with those guys, and so that's something else you can look at, as their two highest recruits. But like you said, Smith's someone else that, Chris, we're talking about this roster. I'm gonna be completely honest with you. We came into this preview. I was just looking at this and I'm thinking, man, I don't know. I don't know. Like, there's just this and that. There's no Pippen. But the more you actually go into this roster, like, the potential is there for this team to still do a lot of good things.
Yeah.
Like I said, I think the biggest challenge is knowing just what you have to go up against night in and night out in the SEC. But I'll be honest with you, like, it's those questions of, okay, how drastic, is that change from no Pippen? That's a big question, because you've got to see people step up and carry that scoring load. And there's the playmaking ability, having that go-to guy when you're in a 2-point game, right, in Arkansas, in Fayetteville, at Bud Walton, and you've got to get the ball to someone and you've got to score. You knew whose ball,
Mm-hmm.
you knew what that situation was going to look like before. Now it's just, all right, we needed to kind of define what that's going to be. But man, they've got options here, and that's why I almost wonder if am I selling this team a little bit short when you actually look at the roster. But I think the reason why is that we say all of this, but I still don't think we have a good idea of what it actually looks like altogether.
Yeah.
We see the individual pieces, right? But what does it all look like? What's that 8-man rotation, 9-man rotation? What does that look like come December? And I think that's still yet to be figured out. And I think once we have a better grasp on that, then maybe you kind of reset your expectations for what Vanderbilt can do once SEC play gets here in January.
Well, there's a lot of variables with this team, right? And the one we keep repeating is what does it look like without Pippen? In other words, how much of what Jordan Wright did and Studi did with the things that those guys did well was a product of having Pippen on the floor and the focus of everybody's attention. In other words, as standalone guys without a dude, can they produce at the level they did or maybe better? And with Studi, it's can he get better at the other stuff to stay on the floor? I think and I feel like as we are going through and we're getting to being the point of being almost halfway done with the SEC, I feel like every team with the league you go into and you kind of look at them on paper, you glance at them, you read the preview, and then you dive in and you start talking about them for 30 or 40 minutes. You're like, wow, this team's got some parts that I didn't really think of. And I'm getting that with Vanderbilt. I'm kind of like, as we talk through it, I think this might be a better team than I thought. I think right now Vanderbilt is 72 in Bart Torvik. That's from memory. I feel like 5-10 years ago, we take this team, we transport it into another time, and it's probably an NIT team that if you get some big wins, say you beat Memphis and Nashville, you beat St. Mary's and Anaheim, you start collecting some of those wins, maybe you can get to 500 in the league, or maybe a game above. Maybe you're sneaking in as a 10, 11, or 12 on Selection Sunday. The problem is it's the rest of the league, right?
Yeah.
It's getting to 500 is going to be a real, just getting to not play the Wednesday game for Vanderbilt right now would be a big accomplishment.
Yeah.
Which that's something I think we never would have thought we would have said 10 years ago, but that's where this program has been. Everybody in the league has gotten more serious about basketball. And I feel like with everybody's roster, when we dive in, we're going, okay, I could see a scenario where this is an NCAA tournament team or Sweet 16 team or fill in the blank. And I feel like that's what they've run into.
Yeah. And the thing is, like right now, right, given we've done, this is going to be our 5th or 6th team preview I think we've done. And it's like, I'm looking at it and thinking, I'm so optimistic now the more I look at this Vanderbilt team. But I'm like, realistically, as of this moment, there may be 4 teams I could put them ahead of, entering the season, and that's the thing is like, they could be a good team, but it's just again, I said earlier, like I think there's legitimately 5 top 20 preseason teams in the SEC, maybe top 15 for some people. And then I think
Maybe
you've got
I would say there's maybe 6 top 25 teams.
yeah, I was going to say, and then you added a 6 that's probably in the top 25. So like that's just the ground that you have to make up and give them credit. Last year, they started to close that gap a bit. Can you continue doing that this season? Because look, too, something else we haven't talked about, and it goes back to the very first thing you said. This is Jerry Stackhouse's 4th year on the job. There are a lot of new coaches, Chris, in the SEC this year. I mean, well, there's 6 coaches in new spots, counting Mike White, who goes from Florida to Georgia. So, like, there's no guarantee that all of these guys are
Mhm.
just going to hit, right? So it does open up. There's a lot more, you know, instability in terms of like it seems like forever there was like no coaching changes, but now a lot of programs are starting over. So can Vanderbilt keep the momentum from last season, push that forward this season with a much more intriguing roster now that we've looked at it than maybe I would have thought initially? Yeah, so I we'll see. But man, I tell you, their big man group gives you a lot of excitement, I think, and especially bring in Manjon, what Thomas could be, Wright, those kind of guys that we know that have been there that have the potential. It's just consistently doing it. Yeah, like there's a lot of pieces to work with here, I think, for Jerry Stackhouse.
Well, here's the other thing. When we look at numbers and like it's easy to go back and say this guy hit 6 3-pointers. Unless it's built on blocks or steals, it's hard to quantify who has done what on defense. But however Vanderbilt got there, Stackhouse has taken that team from a miserable defensive team to one that was 43, 44 in an adjusted defensive efficiency at Ken Palm. The major loss again was Pippen, who had led them with 70 steals. But when I watched him, I didn't always feel like he was a great defender. That was a knock on him. So were we underrating his defense? I don't know. But that's the thing that it's like hard to. I feel like Vanderbilt gets it done. Like that's where Malora Brown and Robbins and some of those guys on the back end, just by being big and being in position, make it tough to score. Um, there's something here that's hard to quantify. In some cases, it's worked for them on defense that he's built on, and Stackhouse has been very open that okay, I got my guys in. We want to do some more pressing and trapping and stuff, and so there's kind of an element to Vanderbilt probably that doesn't get talked about in terms of what they're going to do there.
Yep, no, that's fair. So we'll see. Yeah, like I said, it's not always just about what you do; it's about what everybody else does around you. And I think just because of the league and where things stand, I wouldn't be surprised if Vanderbilt does kind of make a move this season. It's just how far up can they get in this current landscape? It's just it's so hard to know.
Yeah.
But they've got the size, I think, to and as I said, we haven't looked at every roster, but their size is going to be comparable, to some of the top teams in the league in terms of what they can do matchup wise with their size. It's just from a skill standpoint, can you also match it there? And I think that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. So
Ken Palm's preseason stuff has not come out at this point, has it?
no,
Okay.
curious
Mark
to see.
Torvik is,
Yeah,
yeah. Torvik's got them at 12 in the league. I think 7 and 11. And like I said, but 71 overall. That's an NIT level team in most leagues. If you can get to, a couple games over 500. Blue Ribbon, our good friend Chris Dortch, who does a great job, picked them 14 of 14 in the SEC. Lindy's picked Vanderbilt 11, and I believe said there's a lot of upside beyond that. I think a lot of upside beyond that. To finish higher might be stretching it given the league. But point is, this is a team that is probably best way to say it, maybe a borderline NIT team heading into this, but you start bagging some big wins. You can beat Memphis, maybe Temple on the road, St. Mary's. You start winning a few of those that you're not supposed to get and don't stub your toe at home. Maybe get to 8 and 10 in the league, which is probably on the fringe of realistic, albeit tough. I would bet against it. If you're Vanderbilt, that to me is the recipe for getting on the NCAA bubble, which again, I think it's a stretch, but it's not the craziest thing either.
yeah. I think the best thing to do is start looking at the teams ahead of you, and South Carolina, Georgia, to me, are teams that we probably still don't know what to do with. But what do both of those teams have right now? I think it's a proven top star, right? Like South Carolina's bringing in Gigi Jackson, who's a top 7 recruit nationally. Georgia still got Cario Quindo. Teams like that. And I think, Mississippi State's Chris Jans did a great job bringing back guys who are proven. So I think that's the thing is what winds up being the separator between those kind of teams. And I think that's still the big question. And we'll see if Vanderbilt can, again, make up that ground, because they will be picked in the bottom fourth. We'll be at SEC Media Day next week. So they're going to be picked in the bottom four somewhere. But it's just how many of those people picking them in a bottom four have really gone into the roster maybe the way we have over the past almost hour here, and looked at, again, the upside. I think there's a lot of it there. It's just, games aren't won on paper, and but the upside is there. And what do they do without Pippen? Everybody's going to ask that question, and still they tip the ball off in November.
All right, we have previewed several SEC teams. We will be previewing the rest. So best way to get coverage of every SEC team, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss anything. You get notifications. You get notifications of our live show on Wednesday nights. Of course, we're doing a lot of football coverage. That is a listener-driven show where you interact with us, ask us questions. We have a lot of fun there. So anyway, thanks for watching. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do it. Thanks to our sponsor, Steaks, and we'll see you again soon at Southeastern 14.